I think we often overlook the fact that most of the time, the reason that people aren't having as many kids as they used to is simply because they don't want to. And we know that's the case because lots of other countries have put policies in place to try to encourage people to have children, and they don't work across the board anywhere in the world. They don't work. And I think that's because a lot of times it just has to do with what the woman and men decide they want out of life, and that's not always kids.
I'm Keltie McGuire, and you're listening to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Kids Are Childfree podcast. Something I really enjoy about the work I do is I get to meet all sorts of fascinating people who are also doing work that sort of intersects with this kids or child-free decision, whether that be people who are writing about this decision or thinking about or talking about being child-free, philosophers and authors and journalists and obstetrician gynecologists, like all kinds of different people who are just doing really cool things. And today's guest is one of those people that I recently connected with over Instagram, which, as you know, if you listen, I meet a lot of my wonderful guests through Instagram. And after learning about the writing work that she's doing and the research she's done, I said, you definitely have to come onto the podcast and talk to us about some of these topics, particularly motherhood ambivalence, the notion of the bad mother. You'll learn what that is today, and being child-free in your own story. Monica Cardenas holds an MA and PhD in creative writing from Royal Holloway, University of London. Her research on motherhood in the 20th century novel and the evolution of reproductive rights in the US is central to her novel in progress, The Mother Law, which was longlisted for the Lucy Cavendish College Fiction Prize and runner-up in the Borough Press Open Submission competition. Monica's work has been published in The Audacity, Literary Hub, Litro, Catatonic Daughters, and Sad Girls Club Lit. She is chair of the Democrats Abroad UK Women's Caucus and author of the Bad Mothers newsletter. Originally from Washington, D.C., Monica now resides in the Chiltern Hills just outside London. All right, Monica, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited for this conversation and everything that I know you're going to be teaching us. You are such a bright mind and you have such incredible insights on motherhood, the cultural pressures that we as women face around being moms. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about your own story. So before we get into all that, maybe you can just share a little bit about yourself and a few things that we should know about you.
Sure. I am from Washington, D.C. by way of Pennsylvania, but now I live in the UK, where I came to do my PhD in 2018. And I'm now married to a British person, so I stayed in the UK. And I have 5 younger sisters back in the US in the DC area, so I go back and visit them as much as I can.
Wow, that's a lot of sisters. I don't know if I should be envious because I'm the eldest of 3 and I have brothers, or if things are a little hectic with so many women in the family. Is it a bit of both, or is it generally cool having
it's a
so
bit
many
of both.
sisters?
I think it's very cool now that we're all adults. It was frustrating when we were kids, put it that way.
I can imagine. I think a lot of us had frustrations with our siblings, but I can imagine that would be like a lot of energy having 7 siblings of any gender, or used 7. So there's 6 siblings, 7 of you in total, or 7?
There's 5. There's 6 of us in total.
Six of you in total. Okay. Okay. I am curious to hear. Now, you are child-free by choice, correct?
Yes.
Is that a decision that you had to arrive at, or would you say that is sort of a knowing or inclination that you've always had not to have children?
I think it was an inclination. I write a lot about maternal ambivalence, but I would describe myself more as apathetic. Like, I really didn't have a strong opinion about it. I didn't think about it very much as I was growing up. I never thought like kids are horrible, I never want to have any. I think I just thought about it as a responsibility and a choice that I would make at some point. Because I took care of my younger sisters a lot as we were growing up, as I think a lot of older siblings do. and I think I did a bit more for reasons we might get into later.
Yeah.
But I think I always saw motherhood as a big job.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to weigh my options. I think I had that awareness at least.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was never something that I felt really strongly about. It's not something I deeply wanted ever in my life.
Yeah.
So it didn't feel like I needed to make a decision. I just sort of, went where life took me, and I never worried about when or if I was going to have kids. And then I met my husband when I was 36, 37, I think. So at that point, it was probably, pushing it time-wise anyway. And luckily, he didn't want to have kids either. He didn't feel strongly about it. So we just, kept living our lives and haven't made it a big issue, I guess, because it's not something that's that important to either of us. So it hasn't been a pressure that we felt.
Yeah. Okay. And so, I mean, sometimes I hear from women who have been, ambivalent, apathetic, and I'd actually love in just a moment to give a small definition to these terms in the context of the conversation, how we're going to use them. But then sometimes when you are faced with a situation where you find out you either can't have kids or you have a partner who really does or doesn't want to, that can throw things into question. However, what I'm hearing from you is it was just like, okay, great. I haven't really wanted this. You don't want it. So was that pretty clear cut then, or was there any sort of more clear decision point when you found out your partner did not want kids?
Yeah. I mean, I think our relationship took off pretty quickly. I think we both knew that it was going somewhere serious. So I did bring it up because I knew that I was at the point where I needed to really make a decision about whether I would have kids age-wise. And I wanted to know if that was important to him, because I wanted to make sure we were on the same page and make that choice together. And he said that it wasn't something that he was that worried about. So we agreed to have a open communication about it always. And we do check in with each other periodically. There was a point that I've, dwelled on a bit, because he had a conversation with a friend of his about this, and his friend who has children said, well, have you thought about freezing your eggs? He didn't say it to me. He said it to they were talking.
Yeah.
And then my husband later told me that. And I did have a moment where I thought, well, maybe I should think about doing that. What if I do change my mind later? And I even looked it up. And then I realized I was too old already to do that anyway. I think I was 39 or 40 when that happened. But I didn't really want to. So I always find that a curious response that I had to, someone else who doesn't, know our relationship that well anyway. But that's just more evidence to me that the assumption that women want kids is everywhere. This was a well-intentioned friend. He's not, some misogynistic jerk. He, was just genuinely looking out for us, I think. So I think that's just more another example of how, even me, who I think about this every day, the ambivalence and the apathy, and how motherhood is a cultural pressure we all face unnecessarily. Even I sort of fell prey to that, when someone else said, maybe think about this. I did for a minute. And then I realized, one, it's not an option, but also I don't really care. I wasn't worried about it when I realized I was too old. I was just like, oh, okay. Moving on. Yeah.
It's funny how our response to, taking certain steps or making, we can call them sub decisions of this bigger decision, that can be a bit of an indicator in terms of I just really don't want to, or I don't want to have to pursue this more. Or I think that obviously is it really tells us how we feel. But it is also interesting, like you say, that despite you having thought about this in so many ways for a long time and being confronted with this in your work every day, that you're like, maybe there's some truth there. Like, it's so interesting how, because the assumption is so large that women will eventually want to have children, that we question our own knowing. It's quite crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, can we give a bit of definition? So ambivalence, apathy, sometimes these are used interchangeably, but when it comes to like feelings about motherhood, maternal ambivalence or apathy, how do you differentiate the two?
I would say for ambivalence, it's more like you're not sure. Sometimes you think you want kids and sometimes you don't, or sometimes you're happy having kids and other times you're not, if you already have them. So I look at ambivalence that way. And then the apathy is just like, you don't have strong feelings one way or another. It's just, you know, it's not something that you think about very much.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Good differentiator. Okay. You reminded me of a story, which this conversation's about you, not me, but just on the topic of other people not really being able to get this head around the idea that women can choose not to have kids or be unsure about whether they want them or not. My husband said to me yesterday, he said, anytime I tell people about what you do, he was meeting some new people through work, and if he's traveling and whatnot, saw his godfather over the weekend, who we haven't seen in a long time. He said, they're just like, they're so confused about like, what do you mean she does that? Like, i.e., and not so much that this is a job that exists, but more that people have this need, that people would be undecided and unsure. And I mean, I appreciated him telling me, but I kind of was like, oh, okay, well, I said, out of curiosity, are these all men who are surprised? Because what I hear from most women when I tell them what I do, now, certainly there's some women who have been very affirmative about it. Specifically those people who've always wanted children. I think there maybe is a bit of confusion of like, oh, interesting that that's something that other women grapple with. But virtually anyone who's child-free, even if they've always had confidence, and so many other people who have yet to make that decision are like, they get it immediately. They're like, oh yeah, of course, it makes sense. And like, or I wish I questioned that more. And, I'm so glad we're having this conversation. So I had to chuckle that, the men are like bewildered. What? There's women who maybe don't want this?
Yeah, of course.
I'm sure we're going to be talking a little bit more about your journey and, some of your personal experiences around being a child-free by choice woman. But I want to hear about your writing and the work that you do and where you've been focusing yourself, through your graduate work and postgraduate work, your PhD. And I want to hear about Bad Mothers as well. So can you just set the stage a little bit about what, where you focus yourself and what kind of work you do?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with my PhD research. I started that in 2018, and it really started with abortion rights. So the PhD program I did is in creative writing and literature. So I had to write a novel, which was my main focus. But alongside that, I had to write a research component that sort of complemented the novel. And since the novel has to do with abortion rights and women who don't want kids, that is sort of where the research took me. And what I really wanted to accomplish with the novel is to give an example of women who don't want to have kids, are assertive and sure about that, and it's not weird. Like, I wanted to build an atmosphere where it was just a normal choice to make and nobody thought anything of it. And so then for my research, I started looking back through literature for other examples of this, or examples of restrictions to reproductive rights and sort of how that has evolved over time. So the first novel that I looked at was The Bell Jar, which is one of my favorite examples. And maybe I'll save some of the details for later, but it started in the 1960s, my research, and went through basically to today. I was looking at contemporary novels as well, and really just searching for characters who don't want kids, who acknowledge that, and who don't feel sorry about it,
Yeah.
who maybe have had an abortion and don't feel guilt about it, who just, made a decision that was best for
Yeah.
them without, dwelling too much on, any kind of remorse or guilt, or without feeling the guilt for it.
Yeah.
Without having that weight or that responsibility to have kids just because they're women and culture tells them they need
Yeah.
to. So that's sort of the research that I started, and then I didn't want to stop once I finished my PhD. So that's where Bad Mothers came in. And I realized that, in addition to looking for women who don't want to have kids, or women who've had an abortion and are unapologetic about it,
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to just broaden it to the point I'm making with Bad Mothers is it's tongue in cheek. Everyone is a bad mother because you can't win under the patriarchy.
Yeah.
You either are, ridiculed for going back to work after you have a kid, or others will criticize stay-at-home moms for having no life outside of parenthood or
Mm-hmm.
motherhood. Or you don't have kids, so what are you contributing to society?
Yeah.
Or you have too many kids and you're a drain on resources, or it just goes on and on and on. There's no way to make everybody happy, and
Mm-hmm.
that is the point of Bad Mothers.
Yeah.
Everybody falls into one of those categories, unfortunately. So I wanted to give space for everyone,
Mm-hmm.
and without any judgment, for whatever choice a woman makes is her own,
Yeah.
and that should be acceptable by everyone.
Yeah. And so, and just to clarify for anyone who had missed that, so Bad Mothers is the name of Monica's Substack, where you do write then about both, what we might deem as a bad mother, women who have had children who maybe aren't showing up,
Mm-hmm.
behaving, acting in ways that we deem good, which, as you point out, is virtually doing anything. but your primary focus, though, is on women who have not had children. Is that correct?
Yes, I do focus mainly on that choice.
Mm-hmm.
And that's for the reason I was explaining with my research, is I'm
Yeah.
searching for examples in
Yeah.
books mainly, but also films and television shows, where women who not only don't have kids, but who embrace that identity.
Yeah.
Because I think there's lots of examples, I think, of women who don't have kids in the world, but we don't really know that about them, that maybe they're known for other things, which is fine.
Yeah.
I don't think it should be
Yeah.
your entire identity by any stretch, but I think
Mm-hmm.
we do need examples of women who don't have kids and don't feel sorry about it,
Yeah.
and just, are living their lives happily.
Yeah. Agree. Was this, I mean, as someone who had this apathy around having children, like, was that something that you were searching for, looking, like, personally, would you say, looking for confirmation, or was it that you noticed an absence, or how did you turn your focus and attention to doing this work?
Yeah, I think I was looking for examples,
Yeah.
and not consciously at first, but then
Mm-hmm.
I would find some examples. I've written about this before, but Ann Patchett is a writer that
Mm-hmm.
I really
I
admire,
love her.
who writes these characters pretty consistently across her novels. In some cases, they are really vocal about the fact that they don't want children, but in other cases, they are just, normal
Mm-hmm.
women going about their lives who have happened not to have kids.
Yeah.
And there aren't a lot of examples of that in our culture.
Yeah.
So those are the sorts of stories, that I've been looking for. And I think Ann Patchett's one of the first that I came across in her novel State of Wonder. And then also in The Patron Saint of Liars, which was her first novel. I didn't read it until later.
Mm.
Um, but that's another good example of someone who's an ambivalent mother.
Yeah. And interestingly, those are two of her novels I haven't read. I was looking at one of
Mm.
the pieces. I don't know if it was on your own Substack, but it was an article that you'd written looking at characters in her books who had not had children. And,
Mhm.
it's like, I'm sure you don't necessarily notice it until you notice it, right? Like, it's like you don't notice the
Yeah.
absence of these things until you either are searching it out as you are doing, in the work that you do. If you're looking for that sort of validation of like, which I think, by the way, like super normal. I still very much am always happy if I find out that a woman in the public eye I admire has forgone having children. Like, I think we all like to know that there are people like us who have similar values, even if we do feel confident in our choices. Maybe not everyone, but I think that's a pretty common human need.
Mhm.
And so it's interesting, having read Bel Canto, which is one of my favorite books, and Magician's Assistant, not having like thought
Mhm.
about it through that lens, but I do remember reading, is it Tom Lake? Is that her most
Mhm.
recent? Okay. I knew it was
Yeah.
a man's name, but it did not escape my attention that one of the daughters in the book states, I and me and my partner do not want children. And I was like, oh, it stood out to me because it's so uncommon. And we see this, it's like, this trope in every romance novel of like boy meets girl. And then what happens, we do the fast forward 1 year. It's like almost always ends in the white wedding, the baby coming.
Mhm.
And for me, it's always been like, I don't want to say a letdown, but I so often have this feeling when I read a book that I'm like, I just hope that they like, if they want kids, I hope it happens for them. But like, it would be so nice. It's so refreshing when that's not part of the story, at least for me as
Yeah.
a woman who's chosen not to have kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you should read the other two novels
Yeah, I
because I
definitely
think they're
want to.
stronger examples
Yeah.
of what we're talking about. And I think of course, there are stories out there if you're looking for it. But what I'd really like to see is more where um, women are more assertively identifying
Yeah.
as not having kids or deciding not to have kids, like in the example you just gave in Tom Lake. I think that's more rare, and
Mm-hmm.
that's what I'd like to see more of.
Yeah. Yeah. And even where it's like, I think it's nice to have a book where it's like, that's kind of the main story. Like I think about Emma Gannon's Olive, like where it's, she's grappling with ambivalence and indecision. Those are books that are important to have. But it's also nice when like, it's acknowledged, it's clear that that person doesn't want a child, but it doesn't have to be the whole storyline. It's just like
Yeah.
when we talk about any sort of like marginalized group of people, it's like we can include, someone who's like LGBTQ or someone who's Black or whatever in stories, in films, in books, and not have it be like necessarily about their oppression or about like, and not to say we
Mm-hmm.
omit those stories, but they can be like a person, a character in the story because it's like representative of a cross section of society, right? It doesn't have to be like the main focal
Yeah.
point.
And it does, like, I mean, in literary studies, we say that those kinds of stories can be consciousness raising. So
Mm,
it's a way to signal to society that this is a normal thing. It's
totally.
it's maybe it's a change from what we're used to, but we're evolving, and we need those examples to feel more validated, I
Yeah.
think, and for others to recognize it as, normal. And I
Hmm.
always point back to like Modern Family, that sitcom. I
Yeah.
think it like did a lot for supporting LGBTQ rights and uh, marriage rights, and even the other sitcom Schitt's Creek. Same thing.
Hmm.
I think you realize if you maybe are a homophobic person or more closed-minded that these are just regular people like
Yeah.
us,
Yeah.
right? So obviously we should have all the same rights, and I think having more examples of women who don't have kids or who feel ambivalent or apathetic that
Hmm.
can have serve the same purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. Agree. So I don't think that anybody listening probably would be surprised to hear or would disagree with the idea that there is a very prevalent notion of how a woman should be in society, and specifically where it concerns having kids, right? Like it is so prevalent, the idea that we grow up, we have babies, we raise children, to the point, so many of my guests say to me, well, even if I didn't really want it, I just assumed I would have it because that is what I saw. That is, of course, the legacy that came before me. And so while I don't know if people would disagree with that, I think they would agree, yes, that's true. I also believe that they may not realize just how culturally ingrained it is, this idea that as a woman, like this is equal to being a mother. And so I'm interested if you can maybe speak to this, because I know this is something that you've studied and that you pay close attention to. Like, if we can look at a few different areas of society, if you will, maybe we can start with books, or movies or TV shows, because we just were talking about that, but like examples of how pervasive this is, such that you talk about bringing certain characters and stories to a conscious level or raising consciousness. I think a lot of this is obviously operating right now at an unconscious level, that having kids is just what you do. So could you share a few examples about that?
Yeah, I mean, one book I mentioned earlier is The Bell Jar, which again was published I think in the US in 1960, maybe a few years earlier than that elsewhere. But that novel really sticks out to me as an example, because through the majority of the novel, we're with Esther. She's in her early 20s. She's doing a magazine internship in New York City, and she is obsessed with this, with not having kids. She wants to be a poet. She doesn't want to be like her mother. She really belabors over watching. She once saw a woman giving birth because her boyfriend is a med student, so she witnessed this, and she's just sort of repulsed by the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And so I think you could also make an argument that part of her mental health issues that take place in the novel are rooted in that anxiety, because she recovers quite quickly after she has access to contraceptives. However, if you read the novel carefully, you will notice that in the first couple of pages, she, before we sort of flash back to her 20s, she has a baby. She references a baby. So in the first couple of pages, we find out she has a baby, and then we go back to this time when she was a bit younger, and she spends the whole story worried about not having kids. She doesn't want to have kids. So I came away from that novel thinking, what are we supposed to think about this? She was so clear in what she wanted. Yeah. And then she wound up having a child anyway. And of course, there's a lot we could go into with Sylvia Plath's own life, but I won't presume to know what was, in her heart. But that novel really stuck with me because it was the 1960s. That's what women did. But it was also a time when we were starting to think about what other things women might want to do, and whether or not all women could be fulfilled by being a housewife, which is kind of what the expectation was. So that's one example. I think we talked about Anne Patchett. There have been other novels where The Mothers by Britt Bennett, there's an abortion that's sort of no big deal that takes place in the novel, which I found refreshing. And there's the novel, or autofiction, I guess it's classified as, by Sheila Heti, called Motherhood. And you probably know this one because the whole thing is her trying to decide whether she's going to have a baby. That one really grated on me because, in my opinion, in my experience, her belaboring that decision was a result of the pressures she felt from everyone else. To me, when I was reading it, it was very clear the narrator was not interested in having kids, but she spends, 300 some pages thinking about it because everybody else is telling her, everything else in the world is telling her that that's wrong. So that one really frustrated me. But then as I said, there's other examples that you might miss entirely. So I think about I'm someone who watches The Office on a loop in the background, and Phyllis, I think, is the only female character on the show who doesn't have a child, and she does have. We do find out she has had one as a teenager and gave it up for adoption. But she's really interesting to me because she's, I think, in her 40s-ish, right? And she has a really happy, exciting marriage and happy life. And it's never really, the fact that she doesn't have a child never really comes up. Nobody's asking, after she gets married, nobody's like, so Phyllis, when are you having a baby? Which is what everybody else hears. So that character is interesting to me. I've thought about that a lot. Obviously, it's a comedy. It's not really meant to dwell on those sorts of things, but I do find it interesting that, that character exists in that context, and we don't really notice it.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that there are somewhat obviously easy for you to point because you've done this work, but we can point at so few examples of women who live outside this sort of norm of having children or that being central to their story if they're of that age, just shows that it is all around us all the time, what we're reading, what we're listening to, what we're seeing. I'm curious if you have examples. I know you mentioned before we spoke, examples of just how pervasive this pressure around being a mom is, even in healthcare and politics. So can you share a couple examples from other areas of life?
Yeah. In healthcare, I mean, I think it's difficult for women of what they call childbearing age to access some medication that isn't safe to take when you're pregnant, right? It becomes a lot more complicated to access. Even if the patient isn't planning to get pregnant or isn't planning to have kids, that doesn't seem to matter. And then there's lots of stories of young women who are maybe feeling a little bit like Esther from the Bell Jar, who want to have a permanent solution to not getting pregnant, right? So they want to have tubal ligation or something along those lines. And if they, depending on the doctor, young women will really struggle to access that because the doctors will always assume that she'll change her mind or, she's too young to make that decision. And in politics, I mean, I'm sure we've all there's no one who has missed the famous childless cat ladies ridicule. And the constant concern over the falling birth rate. I see that at least once a week in the news somewhere. And the responsibility is always on women to have more kids to fix this so-called problem, which, is deemed to be an economic problem. When I'm sure, I'm not an economist, obviously, but I'm sure there are.
I mean, I'm sure it's an interesting profession, but
but I'm sure there are other solutions that are possible to whatever problems we've identified with having fewer kids. But the onus is still coming back to women. The thing that I find really frustrating is that in the surveys and studies they've done, Pew, I think, does this every year, asks people who don't have kids or who aren't planning to have kids, why, the top reasons why. The top reason is because I don't feel like it or I don't want to. But every news story that reports on that survey skips right past the first reason and goes into the other reasons, concerns about climate change, not the right partner, financial concerns, which I don't want to diminish. I think those are very real problems, and they should not be something that that stop someone from having a kid if that's what they want. And I think those problems need to be addressed, absolutely, especially in the US. there's so much more that could be done to support families.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think we often overlook the fact that most of the time, the reason that people aren't having as many kids as they used to is simply because they don't want to. And we
Yeah.
know that's the case because lots of other countries have put policies in place to try to encourage people to have children, and
Mm-hmm.
they don't work across the board anywhere in the world. They
Yeah.
don't work. And I think that's because a lot of times it just has to do with what the woman and men decide
Mm-hmm.
they want out of life, and that's not always kids.
Yeah. All right, it is a new year, which means we are kicking off a brand new round of my 3-month group coaching program, Kids or Child-Free. If you are a woman who is on the fence about whether to have kids or stay child-free, you have been grappling with this decision for far too long, you would like to make 2025 the year that you finally come to a clear and confident choice, you are certainly going to want to check out the details on this program and hopefully join us for the next 3 months. I will include a link to the details in the show notes of today's episode. You can also find info over at kidsorchildfree.com. And rather than going on about how wonderful this program is, which, by the way, it is very wonderful, I thought I would leave you with a little bit of feedback from one of the recent program participants. Here's what she shares. She says, I had never done anything like this before, but Keltie's content reminded me that there are so many others out there that struggle with this decision. I previously pursued counseling on this topic and found it wasn't helpful. The program helped change my perspective on how I view the decision and how I perceive myself in the process. I now have more peace and self-compassion on my true feelings about having kids or remaining child-free. Working through this with other women who were also on the fence was powerful and meaningful. I would highly recommend this program. All right, so I will leave you to think about those words shared by one of the recent participants. If you can relate, if you've been trying all the things, maybe you've tried therapy, maybe you've been reading all the books, you've been listening to the podcast, getting some insights, but you still feel like you haven't sort of broken through to get that clarity that you need. Again, the details will be in the show notes of today's episode, and I look forward to hopefully having you join us for the next round of my Kids or Child-Free group program. Yeah, I agree with you. It's a little bit of a frustration I have. And I also want to be cognizant because I realize, to your point, financial pressures or stresses, lack of social support, health concerns, those are all very valid concerns for people who are thinking about having kids. But I agree with you that I do think, and from what I hear, fundamentally, you just, if you don't have kids, not always, but often it's because you just don't want to have kids. And the way I think about it is, it's kind of like I can talk about, for example, my concern for our planet and the environment, climate change. I can talk about, whatever other factors and how they play into my decision. And it's not that those things aren't true, but it's sort of almost like a kind of justification to maybe explain something that's really more of a felt sense. Like it's bringing an intellectual side to something that is just that inner longing or wanting is not there. And it's funny because, and I'm sure people listening have heard this before, but it bears repeating, nobody is asking parents to validate or justify why they've had children. And yet, if you don't have children, it's expected, why don't you have children? Why have you chosen not to have children? And then, of course, no reason is good enough. And that's also part of the reason that I'm a little bit reluctant to sometimes share in conversation, which very few people ask me, but I remember having a friend of my husband asking, why have you and Chris decided not to have kids? And it was well-meaning, but I said to him, I could tell you different reasons, but you're I'm sure very well-meaning, but I know that you will probably be able to, or try to counter any, the future is uncertain. Well, the future's always been uncertain. Oh, well, because of this, well, you're well set up to have kids, so don't worry about that, whatever it is. I deal with mental health. A lot of people have mental health issues, okay? But saying I don't want to, what, people are going to tell me I should do it anyways, and people will, but most reasonable people are well, if you don't want to, I guess you probably shouldn't have kids. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's another thing that really grates on me is this demand for an explanation when it's a personal choice, right? You shouldn't need to explain yourself to anybody else. But for some reason, people feel comfortable asking for a reason.
Yeah.
Obviously, close friends and family, I'm happy to talk about it, but
Yeah.
I think strangers want to know. I went to have an eye exam recently, and the doctor was just making small talk, I think, and he asked if I had children, and I said no, and he said, "Oh," and like frowned at me, and I just thought, well, that's such a strange thing to do. I mean, what if I
Yeah.
really wanted them and couldn't have them? That would be
Absolutely.
devastating, a devastating conversation with a stranger. Um, but just like the assumption was there on his part that, of course I want them, or why wouldn't I?
Yeah.
And it's just odd to me that strangers feel comfortable asking
Mm.
such personal questions,
Yeah.
or
Agreed.
judging personal decisions that way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, we can usually discern, and I try and do this, where is it just curiosity and wanting to know more? And when is it really like they've come in with their
Mm-hmm.
judgment, their preconceived notions of how it is. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
unless they really are seeking to understand, it's like, you know what, you're going to think what you want about me and why I've made my choices. So
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
on your merry way.
I think the thing that was really upsetting about the whole JD Vance childless cat ladies thing is that the implication is that women who don't have children by choice are lazy and selfish. I mean, that's the underlying implication. And I think that's why Chelsea Handler, who's famously child free and has done a few little funny videos about it, that's why she had so much ridicule, because she's really embraced that identity, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciate that, because she's saying it's okay to be selfish.
Yeah.
There's nothing, it's your life, right?
Yeah.
It's fine if if that's how you want to live your life.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what I find really frustrating, is that my personal choice is deemed to be a selfish one, or
Yeah.
just laziness on my part, when fine if it is. I mean, it's my decision, but that's not always the case. That's, there, I think a lot of women I know who don't have kids don't have them because there are lots of other things they'd rather be doing instead. They're not
Mm-hmm.
lazy by any
Yeah.
stretch. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I'm interested, or I guess I want to ask, would you be open to sharing just a little bit about your, I would say, relationship or your estrangement with your mom, and specifically in the context of this decision? I understand that you've been estranged from
Mhm.
your mom for quite some time now. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, I did. I wrote about this a couple weeks ago. Um, yeah, we've been estranged for about 20 years, since I was in my early 20s. And it was not my decision. She decided to cut off contact with me and my sisters. And I have never considered my apathy about having
Mm-hmm.
kids in relation to what happened with my mother. I've never put those things
Mm-hmm.
together until I started writing about it and researching it. And as I talked to people, I realized they were thinking, oh, this is
I was going
because,
to ask, yeah, if that's thrust
yeah,
upon you from other people, like, oh, now I
yeah,
know why she doesn't have children, like the penny
yeah.
drops.
I think many people assume that. And I mean, it could be in some way related, but I've never put those things together. As I said, from like the time I was very young,
Mm.
I was never, playing with dolls and pretending to be a mom. I didn't do that. I pretended to be a teacher. I
Mm-hmm.
remember lining my dolls up and teaching a
Mm.
class, or reading a
Yeah.
book to them,
Yeah.
um, as a teacher, not as a mom.
Mm-hmm.
So um, I don't think that the relationship I had with my mother has played a role really in me not, feeling the urge to have children.
Yeah.
Um, but of course, it's something that I think about, right? I think everyone, when you wonder about what it would be like to be a mom,
Mm-hmm.
you think about the things you would do the same as your mom and the
Yeah.
things you would do differently. Um, and I would do a lot of things differently, obviously. But I don't think that it is necessarily played a role in that choice.
I'm interested. I always say I'm not in the business of advice giving, but it's still sometimes fun to try. I'm interested what sort of counsel you might give someone. So context being, a lot of the clients I work with and speak to, not a lot, but there's of course a fair number that say they had difficult upbringings, relationships with a parent or parents. Sometimes there was trauma, sometimes there was abuse. And many times they are questioning, how is this playing into my ambivalence about this decision or my apathy about this decision? Sometimes there's the feeling of, am I just feeling pulled towards motherhood because I want, a do-over, a healing opportunity, whatever. And then in other times, I've had women ask, maybe I don't want this because what I experienced felt so terrible. So I have my own sort of perspective on this, which I'm happy to share in a moment, but how would you encourage someone to think about that? Or, should they tease that apart, or how might they consider that, do you think?
Well, I think what happened in our lives is always going to have an impact on the decisions we make later. I don't think we can get away from that.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm saying is I don't think you really need to. Definitely, if there was trauma, that should be unpacked. I have been through therapy, not for the purposes of deciding whether to have children or not, or, for struggling with that decision, but just for, dealing with the disintegration of my relationship with my mom.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to, understand how those things that happened as we were growing up have affected us. And, even alongside that, I think you and I have spoken about this, just knowing ourselves and what we want and what we can manage. I think for me, anything that's in my care, I'm very concerned and obsessive about. Even when I had my dog, it was a very anxious time for me, especially when my dog was ill. And I do remember thinking, if I had an actual human here that I was worried about, it would be unbearable. I'm sure, again, this is the reason you don't give explanations to strangers. Any parent would tell me, oh, but you learn, you just get on with it. But I don't think that's something that I want to deal with. So there's that. And then I think I also wanted to say, in terms of my mom, I guess I've also, as I've gotten older, in retrospect, I can see that her life and her job as a parent was really difficult for her. It was very hard work. I know it's hard for all moms, but for other reasons, I think she really struggled. And I think I could see that. And maybe I was able to understand from a young age that being a mom is hard. It's not all rainbows and butterflies. It's really hard work. And do I want to do that? I've always thought about motherhood as a really important, incredibly rewarding, but difficult, trying job. And it's one job among, millions that we can choose from.
I mean, I had a different kind of upbringing, have a different relationship with my mother, but also similar, not similar experiences, but a similar sense growing up that, I didn't come out of my childhood thinking like, oh, I want to do that. I thought, holy hell. I mean, my mother, I think this is really like that most important role and kind of focal point of her life, having raised us kids and remains to this day. Like, we're her everything in ways that I think are both potentially problematic for her as well as like really life-giving. Yet I certainly had never had this like rose-tinted glasses perspective of what it is to have kids. It looked very unrelenting, very difficult. There were a lot of challenges that she was presented with that I thought, ooh, like you say, even from a young age. And I think, what you share is wonderful advice, that if there are things that have happened to us that we've experienced, it definitely is worth exploring that, whether in the context of therapy or journaling or conversation with a close, trusted friend or family member, because it's only going to help us in our lives, to feel better, to navigate our way, etc. I also think we cannot ever fully disentangle ourselves, our personality, our experiences, our genetic makeup from our decisions. Like, it's just, these are the things that all ultimately lead us to what we choose and the lives we live. And so I think I always tell people, like, I think it can be interesting. It can be an interesting thing to question, like, oh, how might this have impacted me? And like, I noticed that. And, I've had realizations since making my decision, certain experiences that I've had that have sort of solidified, oh, actually, it's probably not that much of a surprise that I've chosen not to have kids based on X, Y, and Z. But I think we have to be careful that we don't get stuck in this sort of idea of like, we have to tease everything apart, because it's impossible to figure out exactly what is leading us to feel the way we want to. And if only this one thing didn't happen, and maybe if this wasn't that way, then I wouldn't feel the way I do. Then we just start making ourselves crazy. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the things that that worries me about this state of ambivalence, because I think that it is probably a pretty normal state when we think about ambivalence as sometimes wanting it and sometimes not.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, sometimes things can be appealing and other times they won't be. And I think that's just natural, far more natural than our culture and politics and religion make motherhood out to be, where, it's just something that women must innately want. So I think it's more important that we, redefine it as a choice, and as, it's okay if it's not something you are 100% certain about.
Yeah. Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing you say is like, we can make a decision either to not have children or have children, and not necessarily have to first have full enthusiasm about whatever path we're choosing. That like ambivalence is going to exist no matter what we choose, or that it should be allowed to. Is that what you're saying?
I think so. No, yes, that's what I think. That it's okay to not be 100% certain, right? Yeah. I just had this weekend, I had friends over for Thanksgiving, and they have a little 2-year-old who was adorable and so cuddly and funny and sweet. And I thought, oh, that's really cute. Maybe I'm always asking myself, and I always check in with my husband after we're around kids, like, what did you think? How did you feel?
That too.
And we're both still, no, I don't want that. But I did say, this is ridiculous, but I said, it might be nice to have a baby, like, I don't know, 1 day a week or something like that. Obviously, one, that's not an option. But also, the experience is not going to be the same if you're only with a baby 1 day a week, right? You don't bond, it's not the same thing. I just want, the imagined version of motherhood for a little bit of time, and then my freedom to do what I want all the rest of the time. That's not how life is. So that's why I say it's okay to not be 100% sure. And I know a lot of women worry that they'll change their mind later. And I think that is one, due to the fact that our culture is constantly telling us that we're going to change our mind, or, we'll become, culture's version of what a woman should be eventually. But I try to think about it as, all right, maybe I will change my mind. I've changed my mind about other things in my life. I really don't think I will, but it's not impossible. Okay, but as I said, I've changed my mind about other things. It won't be the end of the world.
Yeah.
Right. If I have to live with a regret, I don't think it'll be a huge regret, because I've gone 42 years of my life feeling one way about it. So I try to think about it that way.
I am curious. Now, you obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, do you have other friends who are child free by choice, or do you spend time with, have colleagues or connect with other people in this community?
I do have a lot of friends who don't have kids by choice, and some that don't have kids just because it didn't happen and they
Yeah.
thought they would want them. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And of course, you do this work that you do, and uh, you seem to be a very, very observational and self-aware person. I'm always interested. This is something I've been thinking about now for some time. Like, do you think that there is potentially a constellation of particular traits that would make someone more likely to choose to be child free? And I got to say, like, I'm always a little bit reluctant to even potentially ascribe any of that onto a person. Like, oh, you're more likely to choose this if you're introverted or extroverted, or if you're this or that. Because I just like mothers, it's like child free people obviously run the gamut of, we're multitudes. That being
Yeah.
said, like, would you say there's anything in particular, like there are any parallels you would be able to draw to say, oh, I've noticed that a lot of child free by choice women tend to be X?
I guess, I mean, I have friends who don't have kids by choice that are like really career driven,
Mm-hmm.
who are artists, writers, who just don't like kids, just openly don't like kids,
Yeah.
Except their own nieces and nephews. Um, so they're all sort of pursuing different sorts of goals, I guess.
Yeah.
But I would say maybe one thing that they have in common is they're very self-aware,
Mm-hmm.
of how they're self-aware, and they have a particular idea of what they want their life to be. They have it sort
Yeah.
of mapped. And maybe it's true that they don't want anything to derail that plan. I have
Mm-hmm.
a lot of metaphors in that, that
Yeah.
sentence. So maybe that's one thing they have in common. I didn't seek out these friends. We just sort of found each other, and we didn't identify this as a similarity.
Yeah.
Like, I don't remember one day having a conversation like, oh, you don't want kids? I don't either.
We
That
should
never
hang out. Let's have
happened.
coffee. Yeah.
but, but, we, I guess throughout our friendship, it just sort of became a talking point.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Maybe I initiated it because of my research, and then I began to realize, hey, all these people I'm friends with don't have kids.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess maybe, it probably has a lot to do with lifestyle and age.
Yeah.
Like, I was in a running club in my 30s in DC. We were all training for a marathon. Most of those people did not have kids, and the one I remember that did, it was always like a crazy juggle in her house between her and her
Mm-hmm.
husband, and who was going to be with the kids while she did her long run. And so I
Yeah.
think, life just gets more complicated when you have children, and so you can't participate in the same sorts of things.
Yeah.
So maybe that's how we all sort of ended up in the
Yeah.
same places.
Yeah. It's always, it's just kind of interesting to marvel. And of course, I mean, if you're focused on child-free people, and then you have that confirmation bias of like child-free people are like this, but of course there's many women who choose motherhood who are also have similar interests and who are self-aware and have
Mm-hmm.
other life paths, etc. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's always interesting. Okay, before we wrap up, I'm curious to hear, what do you love best about being a child-free person, or your child-free life in general?
I think it's just the freedom. I guess because I do this kind of work, I do think about it a lot, and
Yeah.
I can do anything I want, really, within financial constraints,
Yeah.
because I don't have to really check with anyone. Of course, I tell my husband, but
Mm-hmm.
it's more like, hey, I'm not going to be here this weekend, by the way. It's not
Yeah.
like, do you mind if I go somewhere in 6 months because you'll have to be with the kids and share the responsibilities? I just have that freedom, and
Yeah.
I think that's the thing I really value the most, and the time to pursue things that I'm passionate about. I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't I wouldn't have that if I was, just the time in the day, but also the mental space, if that
Yeah.
was occupied by taking care of someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously there'd be less of it.
Yeah. Okay. Before we wrap up, I have 5 questions that I ask my guests, rapid fire questions. The first 2 are finish the sentence. So the first one is being child free is.
Freedom.
Being child free is not.
Weird.
What is one tool or resource that you think might help women who are on the fence about kids?
Well, obviously your podcast.
Great answer.
Um, I think, as I said, for me, I really try hard to think about it as a job, because it is, and I think obviously it's a labor of love. Um, but if we all thought about and framed motherhood as a job,
Mm-hmm.
we would have a better understanding going into it of what it's like,
Yeah.
rather than all the good stuff that comes with being a mom. And I think if it was framed more as a job, we would get those policies and social safety nets that we really need to support
Absolutely.
families.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. What is one thing that you would like women who are moms to know?
That I don't think anything is wrong with them either. I think a lot of times in these child-free circles, especially on social media, there's
Mm-hmm.
sometimes like some judgment or ridicule of like the real moms.
Yeah.
And I feel bad about that. I don't think there should be judgment on either side. And I think if child-free people don't want to face judgment, they shouldn't judge either.
Yeah.
This might be sort of pie in the sky, but I'd really love a world where women aren't judging each other, that we all have the space to do what makes us happy,
Yeah.
no matter what that
Agree.
is.
It's interesting because it might have been, I'm reading Matrescence by Lucy Jones right now. It is Lucy Jones, right? Who wrote Matrescence? I want to make sure I'm getting my
That
authors.
sounds right.
Anyways, but I think it was in that book. It may have been somewhere else though, but effectively saying that this judgment of moms or not wanting to be too mumsy, or like this idea of it being a bad thing, it's actually really like rooted in the patriarchy, and it's internalized misogyny. And I thought, what a good
Mm.
framing, because I think often, and I don't know if these attitudes are shifting, or it's just that I was very conscious about cleaning up my social media feed and not partaking in like this sort of commentary, but like, yeah, this very anti-child, anti-mom, gross, and kind of that it's, demeaning or lesser than. It is rooted in these ideas of how we expect a woman to be, or it's just interesting. I hadn't heard it framed that way, but I thought, okay, the next time I hear a child-free person or see that online, trying to be all like kind of this feminist bravado is probably not the right terminology. Yeah. Bit of a contradiction, I guess. But that's those are ideas that are being thrust upon us from elsewhere, I think.
For sure.
Definitely not loving towards our fellow women. So okay, the last question is, if you could give a piece of advice, one piece of advice to someone who's currently on the fence about whether or not to have kids, what would that be?
Well, going back to what we said earlier, don't worry if you're not 100% sure. Things will be fine. I mean, I'm thinking of your interview with the woman who wrote Maternal Regret.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, Le Regret Maternel. Yeah, Astrid.
Yeah, she wrote about regretting having a child, but she's all right, isn't she? Right?
Yeah, good point.
She's a happy person,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I've seen many examples, because of the side I sit on, of older women who have said they didn't have kids and they don't regret it. And I think we can any decision we make, we can never be 100% certain about it, but I think generally it will be fine, no matter what happens.
Yeah, good advice. All right. Thank you so much for coming on today, Monica. I'd love to have you tell our listeners where they can find you, if they'd like to read Bad Mothers, where they can find that. And of course, we'll link to all the things that you mentioned in the show notes of today's episode as well.
Yeah, thank you. Bad Mothers is on Substack, and I'm also on Instagram a little bit at Monica is Reading.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Really enjoyed this conversation. And there's definitely at least a couple books that I have not yet read that I have to add to my list. So thank you for that.
Thanks. Great talking to you.
That concludes another episode of the Kids Are Child-Free podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's conversation. Now, if you have not already done so, first of all, I want you to give us a follow over on Instagram. Our handle is @KidsOrChildFree. Otherwise, I will link to that in the show notes. And what I would love for you to do is to slide on into my DMs and let me know, who would you like to hear on the podcast as an upcoming guest? This can either be someone in particular that you would love for me to have a conversation with, or maybe it's a certain type of guest. There's somebody in particular that you are wanting to hear from, whether that be, hey, Keltie, I want to hear from somebody who had kids later in life, or I want to hear from somebody who specializes in childhood trauma, or whatever it may be. Let me know who you want to hear from, who would be an ideal guest, and I will do my very best to get them onto the podcast for a future episode.